Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Brian, thanks for joining me, brother. I appreciate your time, and I've been looking into your work for a little bit now. My friend Mandy actually sent some of your links over, and the first thing I read was your Rise of Traumadelic Culture article, and I thought it was fantastic. And I really liked your podcast. I've only heard a few episodes, but I've been really enjoying what you're putting out. So,
Hey, I appreciate it, and thanks for the invite.
absolutely. It seems like we both have a very similar interest in this field, and we both have a lot of reverence for the field of psychedelics in general. And I think there's a lot happening in this more modern renaissance, and not a lot of people can put their finger on some of the issues that are coming this way. It seems like there's this rise in victimhood and trauma culture, and you seem to have the ability to package it and articulate it very well. And I think it's important now more than ever. So I think people are really thirsty for what you're putting out, and that's why we're here today.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, when I started writing critically about what I was seeing in the psychedelic therapy space, it was probably about 4 years ago that I started to publish some things. And I got a lot of people reacting in a very defensive way, which signaled to me that I was onto something, but that maybe the majority of people weren't ready to hear it yet or to think about it for themselves. And I've seen a shift. I decided to collect a bunch of the writing that I've been doing over the past number of years into a little book called Traumadelic, Revisioning Psychedelic Therapy. And in that time, there's a lot more receptivity to some of these critiques and the questions that I ask. And that's really like a lot of my writing is just asking questions out loud, contemplating these things out loud, wrestling with things out loud, in the hope that maybe it'll encourage other people to go through that same kind of process of inquiry, not just accepting what the authorities are laying out for us. So, yeah, I think there's been a shift in the culture. I think people are starting to get really tired of the trauma narrative and they're realizing the limitations of it. I think ultimately people want to be free. And I'm seeing a shift. And there's
Yeah.
a woman, Catherine Liu. She's a academic professor in California, and I just had her on my podcast because she's coming out with a book called Traumatized, and she takes a kind of socio-political, economic look at trauma culture and its origins and how it's developed and taken more hold in the wider culture. So I think like our two books are really nice companions to each other because I come at it from like an insider's point of view, someone who's really active and engaged in what I call healing culture, just a very general term, but that's been yoga, psychedelic integration, coaching, facilitation, counseling. And she comes at it from the outsider perspective of the scholar, the critical scholar. And she brings a whole wealth of experience and understanding of politics and socioeconomic factors. So I think together they really lay out a good argument for questioning trauma culture.
Absolutely. I actually just finished that conversation you two had this morning, and I sent it to 3 or 4 friends already. It's fantastic. So I'll make
Oh,
sure
great.
to make people aware of that at the end of the show with a link or something. So fantastic.
Yeah.
I thought she had some really unique perspectives, and she was pretty clear on her perspectives that come from a long, you can tell, a life of learning. So
Hmm.
well informed lady for sure, and she was very interesting. And I think it's going to ruffle a lot of feathers, just like you said, Robert Forte. When people first started hearing a lot of his messaging, I think it's just that when you are ideologically possessed by anything, it's hard to let go. And
Hmm.
it's easy to get swept into the hype. I was when I first got into this stuff 15 years ago. I was very evangelical. I think it's a natural response to find the beauty and all of the transformation that happens in your own life and immediately want to share it and give it and think it's all rainbows and butterflies. And it takes a little bit of courage, I think, to look at the dark side and some of the nefarious elements of the history of psychedelics and see even the stuff like MK Ultra, which we can end up getting into, and what our own government has done on our own citizens, and wondering like, well, where have those programs evolved to now, and what are
Mm.
the implications of what they learned during the 50s, 60s, 70s from those experiments? And you wonder about these institutions, and you wonder about Johns Hopkins and MAPS, and you start to get curious and you start to find out more about it, and it gets very sticky and weird, and you have to really be willing to just see it as it is and not as you want it to be. So
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you probably know much more about that whole history. I've dipped my toes into it enough to understand that there is a real dark history to the use of psychedelics for different reasons. Even Humphrey Osmond, who coined the term psychedelic back in the 1950s, he was working at a hospital in Saskatchewan, Canada. I think he was British, so he was an import, but he was using psychedelics to treat schizophrenia and alcoholism. But I recently found out actually that he was involved. He was being funded by the CIA, and so even under the guise of psychedelic therapy, there was some other kind of research going on under the surface. But for me, I'm mainly interested in helping people. And so, like, what started to bother me about what I was seeing in the psychedelic therapy space was this obsessive focus on childhood trauma as the root cause of our adult problems, and using psychedelics as the latest thing to treat that. And I found, like, working with people, that framework, that belief system that childhood trauma is something we all suffer from and it is the root cause of our adult problems, I found that really limited people, not only in their experience with psychedelics, having this kind of narrow focus on rooting out the particular traumatic event in their childhood that would explain why they're experiencing difficulties, whatever they are. But it also limited their capacity for real healing, which I think involves growth. Something that Jung said really rings true to me. Um, he said, "It's not so much that we solve our problems, as rather it's more that we outgrow them, and that's through expanding our experience of life and our capacity to hold things like discomfort, anxiety, ambivalence." And I see that as very much part of James Hillman's work, who's been a big influence on me. The project of soul making, of feeding and caring for our soul so that it can grow. And we become more insightful, we become deeper people, we have a kind of gravitas to us. I think about what it means to be a soulful person. And, when I contemplate that and I think of the people who I think of as soulful, they're people who are like very at home in their body. They have a kind of a rich inner life. They've had a lot of experience, and they have a capacity to hold uh, both the light and the dark aspects of life. They don't shy away from the darker aspects of life, whatever they are, pain, suffering, that kind of thing, loss, grief, right?
hmm
So that's part of my project, is trying to bring the soul back into psychedelics and into therapy, really.
I love that. And I remember reading in that article, The Rise of Traumadelic Culture, you mentioned, what was his name? James Hillman, quite a few times, and there were some quotes in there, and I really liked it. And you got into some of your history with Gabor Maté. And I would love to hear a little bit about that time you got to spend realizing some of the issues with his, not rhetoric, but his model of thinking about psychedelics for healing, because there's a lot of popularity behind Gabor Mate right now. And in the last 5 years, because I remember when I discovered him, at first I really enjoyed the way he articulated a lot of his stuff. right? There's some essence to it that's beautiful and it's interesting. But I started to really see a pattern of this hyper focus on trauma and childhood trauma as the overarching blanket answer for everything. And it was like I started to then question it, just like you said, with Carl Jung's work, or you look at Viktor Frankl's work, there's a lot of different perspectives that would say Krishnamurti, who you brought up. I love his perspectives about the idea of looking at the sickness of the culture as the environment and not so hyper focused on the individual as the issue. And it becomes a distraction almost, where we have been taught, or we're being indoctrinated right now with this new psychedelic movement, to be almost narcissistically self help oriented as the individual, which keeps us trapped. And I'd love to get into some of your beginning time with Gabor and how you met him and started to discover some of the issues with this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot in what you said there that I could kind of riff on. But starting with like my introduction to Gabor's work, so I'd been working with plant medicines for a number of years, since my midlife crisis in my mid 30s. Um, I went to a therapist who was had a Jungian orientation, so we worked a lot with dreams. We didn't talk a lot about past history, but we focused on the dreams, and the dreams would often reveal things about my family relations and things like that. So we would get into that, but it was always through the dream, and that was really helpful. And then following that, he recommended that I revisit psychedelics, something that I had experimented with a lot in my youth back in the 90s. Did a lot of just kind of wild experimentation, looking to expand consciousness and to explore the outer regions of life and existence. But to revisit psychedelics with an approach to digging deeper. Um, and so I had a mushroom trip that was really helpful in reconnecting me to my creative spirit. It was beautiful. Had nothing to do with past trauma, but more recovering soul is how I'd put it. And I gave him that report, and it was really great. And he said, "Well, if you want to go a little deeper and go more consistently, you can come to this church that I belong to, the Santo Daime, and we drink ayahuasca as a sacrament, and we do deep work. It's like a kind of a shamanic training ground in a way, because everybody is singing and participating in the ceremony. And so I got into that, and it was incredible. It was beautiful. And I started, eventually I was teaching yoga, and I started to counsel people more, and because people knew that I was working with plant medicines, and they would come to me with their experiences and want to talk about them. So we were doing a lot more than yoga practice. And so then I started to do some training, psychotherapeutic training, so that I could just help people in that way through these conversations. And I noticed that a lot of them, there was a lot of focus on somatics, which was something I was looking for because I was a yoga practitioner, and I found a lot of benefit in doing a physical practice. So any therapy that I was going to be trained in had to have a somatic element to it. Couldn't leave the body out. But what I found with just about all of them was that there was a lot of focus on childhood trauma. And I'd found the same thing in the yoga world. This thing got introduced to the culture, and then it started to permeate all these different therapeutic modalities. It was like everybody had to be trauma informed all of a sudden, and everybody had to read the same books. So we all had to get on the same page about trauma.
Hmm.
And, it started to kind of rub up against what I knew from my experience of healing, which was more about attending to what is happening in the present moment more than what happened in the past. Whether what I was experiencing in my body and my nervous system was a reaction to something that happened in my formative years or not, what I could actually attend to was what was happening in the here and now. And so yoga taught me how to kind of reset my nervous system so that it was more naturally resilient. Um, I could still get triggered, but I would come back down to a baseline much more quickly than I would in the past. And focusing on that kept me from that kind of excessive rumination about what happened that can keep people in that kind of trauma response. So, yeah, at the very beginning of my foray into the world of psychotherapy and counseling, I was noticing this focus on trauma. It wasn't sitting really well with me. And then I started to hear Gabor Maté speak about things. And he was an influence on the way things were done at an ayahuasca center that I eventually went to work at and teach yoga at. So I was engaged with his ideas a bit more, and I liked what he had to say. He did focus on the here and now quite a bit, but there was always so much focus on going back to the childhood experience. It was always this obsessive looking back and trying to root out that formative experience that would explain so much. And I saw him do this with people time and time again, and it became a kind of challenge in a way. He would be in front of a crowd of people and he would ask, who here had a happy childhood? And if somebody had the guts to raise their hand and claim that they had a good childhood, he would offer to bring them up on stage, and he would make a bet with the audience that within 5 minutes he would show that they suffered childhood trauma. And so he would take people through this very kind of directed inquiry. And the end result was always, well, there you go, that's your trauma. And whether it was something as kind of innocuous as the father working too much and not really being around, not being available emotionally for the child or whatever it was, he would cite that as a childhood trauma that is, explains their difficulty with relationships or with substances or whatever it was. Um, and so, yeah, I had a real problem with that. And I started to see other things too. I did do like a year-long training with him in his compassionate inquiry method, which is really an amalgamation of different kind of therapeutic techniques and tools, which is really helpful. Like I think Gabor is a great synthesizer. He goes around, he voraciously reads and explores all these different healing modalities, and he plucks out what is useful and effective, and he kind of puts it together into a system. I think that's his big gift.
Hmm.
Um, but just the overall focus on childhood trauma, I think, is still way too limited. And I started to see things kind of behind the scenes in practitioner calls that I thought were quite irresponsible from him, recommending certain drugs to people for different things. Like I saw him, a practitioner came into the call and said she was experiencing a lot of dissociation from her body. And he recommended that she try ketamine. And when I raised the point that, well, ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic, do you think this is the right treatment for someone who's experiencing dissociation? And he got really reactive with me. He got really angry, and he just shut me down. Said that's not how it works, and he kind of ended it there. And that to me was kind of the beginning of the end for my involvement with him and his ideas. I just
Hmm.
saw that something was blocking him from, I don't know, questioning things the way I was questioning things, from really looking at things in a kind of honest way. Um, so I don't know, and so that was like the beginning. I don't know if that's enough, if that's what you're looking for, but that's some of my experience that started this process of turning the therapeutic lens back on psychedelic therapy and subjecting it to its own analysis and say, like, what's going wrong here? What are the underlying causes? And that's really like what's in the book, is that analysis and then some suggestions for treatment, like how we can bring the soul back into psychedelic therapy.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing that part. And I'm sure that was not easy to deal with because Gabor, he's in a position of power at some level when he's in those arenas, and to
Hmm.
just to treat you that way when you ask or confront some of his ideas is obviously not the right way to handle it. And so you're onto something when you start to see people's reactions. And I've had similar reactions when you start to press back um, in this field. I just feel like a lot of people at the MAPS conference, there was a talk where Jamie Wheel, you're probably pretty familiar with him. He's one of the only people at the MAPS conference that I saw criticize the
Hmm.
whole thing. And he does it because he cares, like we do, and like a lot of people do. And they don't really make those conversations very highly available. And I think the ketamine thing, I've been to quite a few of these sort of psychedelic conferences, and I'm here in Arizona. And as a first responder, you're starting to hear more and more hype around ketamine.
Hmm.
And most people do not talk about the dark history of ketamine, the addictive nature of ketamine, the physiological issues with ketamine for the bladder and other ailments, the disassociation, as you said. I think ketamine's really problematic, and it's probably one of the new opioids of our time. And
Hmm.
now they're doing these telehealth calls, which you've probably heard of, where you can prescribe ketamine and take home ketamine. And so now everyone's doing ketamine. It's the big hype drug. And there's a
Yeah.
reason for it. And, that's actually when you and I started first talking and you said, I want to help people. Well, when I get obsessive about certain things, it's usually to minimize suffering and to try to find and triage what's the most effective thing we can do or look at to see how we got here to mitigate the core issue. And it leads back to that same ugly beginning of the psychedelic deployment, from Operation Paperclip and MK Ultra. As much as people want to avoid that topic, there was a lot learned in that piece that's also being manifest now. That's why ketamine was the first one to be legal, and it is a form of mind control because you're distracting and disassociating people so that they don't then have a emotional response or reactive component to the cultural issues of our times. And so, if you give people a microdosing methodology and you get them to feel good all the time, that's what Huxley would talk about as soma. And I think it's really important to consider that that's the new weapon of mass distraction of our time, is whether it be TikTok or vape pens or microdosing or ketamine treatments, to just constantly be numbing or distracting or disassociating from the culture of our time, the problems of our culture, and to be activated and to organize and to actually do something about it. So
Hmm.
it's all tied together, and it seems like you're right on it, right on the target with a lot of this stuff from what you've experienced in your life.
Yeah. Well, I have a bit of a different perspective, right? Because I'm
Mm-hmm.
obsessed with soul,
Yep.
because it's what I grieve most in the culture is the loss of soul. And so my whole project is about recovering soul in the individual and recovering soul in the culture. So my perspective on something like ketamine is a little different. Um, One of the great things that James Hillman brings to the conversation around the critical conversation around psychology and psychotherapy, and some of these kind of unquestioned beliefs around it, like the developmental model of psychology and things like that, or the trauma theory, is he never leaves out the world and the effect that we have on the world and the world has on us. So he talked a lot about the soul of the world, the anima mundi. And so, one of the ways that he would look at depression is that it's a totally valid response to the ugliness of the world, that depression was a kind of aesthetic response to the ugliness of the world. And so, one of the ways that we cope with that is to numb ourselves, to anesthetize ourselves, to dull the aesthetic response, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I see ketamine treatment being an anesthetic is a way to cope with the ugliness of the world and what's going on in culture. So it's a little bit of a different perspective. Not so much, I don't think about it as mind control so much as just a numbing. So that and what the effect that has is allows people to cope well enough to be well adapted enough to this sick society, as Krishnamurti put it, to get along, to continue the capitalist machine, to keep it running. Um, and so I think if we open ourselves to the world and we start to receive it and we don't numb that aesthetic response, the result of that is we're going to want to be engaged in the recovery of soul in the world. We're going to be like cultural activists. And, that disrupts the system, right?
Yeah.
But like in order to be a real activist, you got to be in love with the world, or to be an activist who is actually creating some change. You got to first like love the thing that you're fighting for,
Yeah.
and whether that's the ecology or whatever it is, the
Hmm.
quality of like entertainment in culture, whatever your focus is, whatever grieves you the most, that
Hmm.
acts like a negative calling. A lot of people think about calling as this positive thing, like I'm going to hear this voice that's going to tell me like what my purpose is in life. But for me, I think of it as a negative calling. Like, what causes me the most pain when it's absent in the world? And that to me is the calling you into attending to that absence, or filling that void somehow. So it's like this old German romantic saying, tell me what you long for and I'll tell you who you are. And so for me, this is my whole focus, is like what grieves me the most is like, God, it's such a soulless world out there. It's like, oh, it's just so much ugliness. Every new building that goes up is just ugly, and there's no attention paid to the aesthetics and the way it affects people. So that's my negative calling. It's like, well, then do something about it. Try to add some soul and beauty to the world.
Yeah. I think we agree on a lot of that actually, because I love what you've just said and I resonate completely. I just think the underlying reason why psychedelics are being deployed in the way that they are through this authoritarian model, top-down trauma model, where you have to check boxes to be in healing to get them, and why, like, say, alcohol's promoted or ketamine's promoted and microdosing might be promoted for healing only if it's this methodology is because of the sophisticated understanding of what they have learned from there are social architects, and we'd have to understand where that knowledge came from Nazi Germany, and there are nefarious actors that are trying to use psychedelics in a negative way, and they have done that. And if we're just too passive and we're too letting them off the hook in that regard, or not willing to look at that component of it, there's no access. Like, most young people don't know they even have the ability to have a really soulful journey here or find meaning. Because if you strip away all of the authoritarian models that are being deployed and you were to just sit in a creek and eat the mushroom, it's pretty obvious that the awe and the wonder is left there with the mystery, and that's the component that's there without all the programming of, like, it's your childhood trauma. And I think that's what bothers me the most, is to see that the awe and the wonder is stripped from the most beautiful mystical experience you might even have in your life, and it may only need to happen once, if it's that powerful. But now what's happening is everybody's trying to play this psychedelic passport, showing there's like a virtue signaling of, I've done this many ayahuasca ceremonies and I've been to
Hmm.
these workshops, and it's like this one-upmanship of trying to gain. It's the same Western problem that we've always had. If we're
Hmm.
using them in this really weird way, but I think we do resonate in a certain part of that. I just seem to think that there's a lot more cultural engineering behind it than I used to think. I didn't used to think this way, and I'm not saying that this is the answer, but man, have I dug into it and seen, holy shit, they learned quite a bit, and it is quite orchestrated. And the funding that's behind Lycos and MAPS is coming
Yeah.
from the same institutions that had all the knowledge. And so it is interesting to see, like, the reason people aren't able to have access to those beautiful, meaningful, transformational, integrated experiences is because it's being deployed in that way. So
Yeah, and I don't discount that at all. I think, there's really something to that. It's just not.
I lost your volume there, brother. 1 second.
Um, where was I?
You were saying you basically, you're not unaware of that social engineering component. You just haven't spent the time, or you're not as focused on that piece.
Yeah, right. I think like, yeah, there's so much here in what you're saying. So one part of it is that we don't really even have to get into like deep dark conspiracies about mind control.
Hmm.
We all we need to do is take a look at neoliberalism and the kind of atomization of the individual as a separate entity from society, and this idea that it's all on us to prosper in this society. It's all on the individual. Um, and I think, like, one of the things when I wrote my first book, Yoga and Plant Medicine, I did like a little tour, and I spoke at a bunch of psychedelic associations and colleges. And one of the things that I was asking the audience to consider, I said, okay, look, if this really is a psychedelic renaissance, and I know a little French because I grew up in Canada and we learn a little French. So I know that renaissance means a rebirth, renaissance. And so if this really is a psychedelic renaissance, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of culture is this thing being born into? Because one of the fundamental things that we understand from biology is that the culture, the environment, the substance in which an organism grows shapes that organism. And if the psychedelic renaissance is happening in this kind of individualist, materialist culture, then our experience, our utilization of psychedelics is going to be formed by that culture. Whereas in the past, psychedelics were happening in the underground or in the counterculture or outside the mainstream, right? And so there was much more focus on consciousness expansion, working with psychedelics to re-enliven our sense of beauty, to enhance creativity, all of these wonderful things that are part of that soul recovery project that I'm so interested in. But when the psychedelic renaissance is happening in an individualistic culture, which trauma culture is a part of, like, it's not the society, it's you, because you're separate from society as an individual. This is like a core belief of neoliberalism. And so if you're experiencing difficulty, well, it's on you. So we treat you as an individual, we treat individual symptoms. Part of that being, well, you've got childhood trauma, and so you need to do your healing work. You need to do therapy around that so that you can be a kind of well adapted, integrated member of this society.
I love that. And yeah, the neoliberalism element is important to touch on. And you've done that in some of your writing that I've seen, but it's still, to me, it's still fun to go back and see, because you're talking a lot about culture, which is so important because it really is our environment that shapes us and we shape it. But the cultural engineering, which Terence McKenna talked about, it's something that is worth looking at, not for you to worry about, and I'm not going to keep hammering in on it, but it is just such an interesting component to the psychedelic movements, because when you look into the 60s, a lot of the psychedelic 60s was shaped so much by the CIA, and it was so much infiltrated that the hippie movement, which I thought was this cool, like, let's get anti-war, let's sort of buck the system, because that's the first thing that usually happens is you start to question your culture and question your consciousness, and it's a really radical tool for dissolving boundaries. But I've heard Robert Forte and many others help me to see a possibility there that's like, we thought we were so enlightened in that time frame when actually we were being distracted intentionally, and that there was a lot of really organized young people in the colleges that were pushing back on the Vietnam War and other issues of the times. And one way to completely disrupt that beautiful organized protest was to get them all high and on drugs and making them think they're enlightening themselves and transcending. Not saying they weren't having these beautiful transformational experiences, but what we're seeing today and what we saw in the 80s with MDMA was you start to use these substances without ceremony and without reverence or without understanding the history of what ancestors have done with them or other cultures have done with them. And it can become this giant distraction, and it can be something to consider if we don't know that we're a part. If we all think we're just doing this stuff as medicine, as ceremony, which you hear all the time now, sometimes I talk to people and they're like, hey, we've done ceremony or we're doing medicine. And
Mm,
really, they're just doing drugs a lot, more than they probably should admit to, right? So I'm seeing actually more people getting um, caught in the momentum of thinking they're healing or transcending when actually they're distracting. And some of the most incredible people in my life, they work for the fire department and they've never done any of these tools. And they're very honest and integral and they treat their families good and they're raising kids and they're building houses. They're actually having a huge, beautiful impact and they know nothing about this subject matter and maybe they never will. And if they ever did need to go to a workshop or a healing for some trauma in their life or to actually feel better, I would hope that they could have a beautiful transformational experience without being swept into this idea that it's all about childhood trauma, as you said, or so
hmm
it's a really big subject, and I don't think it's all about conspiracy. It's more just looking at maybe holding some of that in perspective while we don't keep continuing getting swept into that same trap, because I
hmm
actually think that this trauma culture was orchestrated. And if you don't think it is so, then that's okay too. We should still just look at how do we get ourselves to reorient and get out of it. But I actually do think that big pharma and all of these incentives that are driving check boxes. Like if I go to a therapist at work, she's going to be incentivized to get me to check boxes for trauma because there's so much funding there. And
hmm
then I'm going to be incentivized to go to a $10,000 ketamine treatment for free because there's grants and all this money involved. And so I think it's just incentives, even if you just looked at that as the driving force behind this movement. But
Yeah,
I don't want to over rant about that stuff. I just wanted to bring a little bit more to it.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, again, there's a lot in what you said. I think one of the things that happened in the '60s is again like a product of neoliberalism. It served neoliberalism because a lot of what happened was it became about my journey, my personal journey. So there was activism going on, and that was like a really strong response to what was happening with civil liberties, with the war in Vietnam, things like that. And a lot of those people paid a dear price for their activism. Like it was real. It wasn't just keyboard activism, and
Hmm.
posting a blue square on Instagram or something. Like those are people standing up to the authoritarian forces and paying a price for it and risking themselves for it. So that to me was very real. But at the same time, I think what was happening with the majority of people in the 60s was this focus on my personal journey.
Hmm.
And, how that rolled out was, again, a lot of these people just becoming capitalists. You look at Ben and Jerry's, who upholds this image of being like easygoing hippies, but, they're multimillionaires. They profited from the kind of the hippie aesthetic. Um, Another thing like that you've been touching on, and I just want to kind of bring more emphasis to, is what I really think is the kind of the biggest, or the most, how do I put this? One of the most important elements that helps people to heal or to recover soul is the experience of beauty that one can have with psychedelics or in a ceremony. And I don't think that's given enough emphasis as like a key healing agent, is that reawakening to beauty, the beauty of life. When you take psychedelics in a clinical setting, the protocol is to make that clinical setting as kind of bland and uh, beige as possible in order to not influence the person's trip, right? So it's like unadorned. There might be a little vase of flowers or something like that. So it's very sterile. It's not a beautiful space. It's not a beautiful ceremony. The music is canned. It's usually music that is meant to be as benign as possible, so nothing to again like influence the person's trip. some music without lyrics or lyrics in another language, Sanskrit mantras over a new age keyboard or something, right? Whereas if you go into like an indigenous ceremony, it's full of beauty. I mean, the shaman, when they go to hold ceremony, they put on their work clothes. They adorn themselves beautifully with different embroidered materials, feathered hats, necklaces, bracelets. Um, the space is perfumed with incense. There are songs sung that are beautiful. And I think like when people come out of those experiences, it's often the experience of beauty that reconnects them to their life in a soulful way. It's not the remembrance they had of being abused when they were young or something like that. So it's like, again, going back to that quote of Jung, it's not so much we solve our problems, by getting to the root cause and making the connection between that and this and all that, but it's that we outgrow them. And he would say that the real thing, the real healing agent in therapy is the experience of the numinous. And numinous points to what you're saying about reconnecting or having an experience of awe and wonder. Awe, wonder, and beauty. I'd add that. And that's what really heals.
I agree completely. I've been very blessed to a few years back, maybe 6 years ago now, but I went down and worked with a guy in the jungle named Don Howard who had been down there like 30 years, and he had a beautiful shaman who was in his 70s, Don Robert, and he'd been working with it since he was about 14 with his family, and so big lineage there. But the beauty of the Icaros and the environment that was created, and you're in the jungle with the sounds of the jungle, it was like an orchestra playing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the people there were all in reverence, and there was a lot of humility there. So there was just so many elements that he created over those years that was just like you couldn't get that in a sterile environment that's not in nature. And it's unfortunate to think that a lot of people now, veterans, first responders, people that are desperate to feel good, and it is something that everyone wants to feel healthy, and so now there's just such a business around it, and there's so many ketamine clinics. And I've tried to push back on this model, because how do you scale integrity and open 16,000 ketamine clinics overnight? And then you put people in a super hyper suggestible state, which is the most vulnerable state. And now you've got some random person that went to a 200-hour workshop, or maybe 10-hour workshop, if that. And we don't know if they're qualified. Maybe they have good intentions, because I think people are good and they want to help people, but
Mm-hmm.
it's just unbelievable the amount of damage that can be actually caused. And is the upside even there versus the downside when it comes to these suggestible, powerful, the most vulnerable, powerful states of transformation?
Mm-hmm.
And I just can't see us scaling this model with integrity and doing it. There's so much profit involved, and it's just a big mess.
Yeah. Well, it, it is integrity. It does have integrity, but what is it integrated with? Right. So
Yeah.
within the psychopharmaceutical neoliberal machinations of North American culture, those kind of clinics are in integrity with that.
Yeah. And I
And
heard
so
you
I
bring
think,
up that landmark component where they were training Shipibo tribes to learn landmark. That was disturbing to read. Can you
yeah,
talk about that?
yeah, sure. I mean, at this ayahuasca center that I worked at for a total of about 4 months, I was down there. Um, yeah, the founder was a gringo from America, former, I think, real estate agent who opened up this center. It was quite successful, and he had a tendency to get kind of enamored with different therapy gurus. One of them being Gabor Maté. And Gabor, promoted the Landmark Forum. He said, I don't like their marketing scheme, but they do a lot of good stuff, basically. And so the founder of this retreat center was really into Landmark Forum, and it required anyone who worked there to attend Landmark Forum to go through that process so that they were informed by it. And eventually, what they started to do was bring people down to do these Landmark Forum trainings for the indigenous healers who worked there, because they wanted the healers to be enculturated or indoctrinated into this way of viewing and working with trauma. And I saw that as like kind of old school colonialism. Here we're coming from the north and bringing our belief system down to these people and forcing it on them
Yeah.
for our own gain, so that we can then kind of extract from them. So that really disturbed me, and there was nobody talking about that. Like nobody kind of going, "Hey, wait a minute, what's really going on here?" And and what are we doing to these people by importing our Western beliefs about things? Like, I'd talk to these healers, and I would always ask them, like, what do you think's going on with all these gringos who come here for healing? What do you think's like really going on with them? And one of them told me, he said, "Well, the biggest problem I see is you think too much, you read too much, you watch too much TV, you're too much in your head, not enough in your heart." And so his approach to helping these gringos with all their problems was to help them get into their heart, get out of their
Mm.
heads and into their heart. Another healer, Juan Flores at Mayantiaku, I did a little interview with him. I really liked him, and I liked his approach. The way he held ceremony was just so beautiful and communal and non-authoritarian, and it was just a wonderful experience. My kind of shaman, into like hanging out in his hammock and playing flute and not putting on airs, you know. So
Mm.
I did this little interview with him. And I said, there's a lot of people come down here looking to heal their trauma. What do you think trauma is? Like, what's your view of trauma? And he told me that the way he understood trauma from his perspective was that trauma is when you obsessively think about the same thing over and over again. And he made this motion like a kind of a hamster wheel, this thinking about the same thing over and over and over again, kind of like an obsession with the past.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, to me, that was very revealing. And I mean, in his ceremonies, it was all about like opening us to beauty. They're the most beautiful ceremonies and so gentle. Not a lot of like purging, nobody kind of going into these psychotic states that I'd seen in other centers where there was like this focus on like purging, getting the dark stuff out of you. And there was a lot of kind of peer pressure to have these big cathartic experiences because it was something to report in the integration circle that would be impressive, that would show that you're really there doing the work.
Mm.
Um, so I think like a lot of it was either like encouraged or even performative in some cases to have these like big, explosive, cathartic experiences. And
Mm-hmm.
in Juan Flores' circles, none of that ever happened. Nobody lost their shit. There was very little purging, a lot of singing, a lot of beauty, a lot of good feeling. And a lot of that had to do because he wasn't catering to the this kind of spiritual tourist or the trauma healing tourism.
Yeah.
He had a center that was also preserving this land around this boiling river, which is like one of the wonders of the world. It's fed by these I don't know, subterranean aquifers. So this river is actually like a hot tub and it's steaming all the time. It's really an amazing place. But his circles are open. You can go down there and stay, but there's not going to be a Western facilitator there interpreting for you or holding integration circles or anything. He's got a small staff, mostly a family, who will like make food for you and make sure that you're comfortable enough. But none of them speak English. And he's also, so you go into his circles every other night or every 3 nights, whatever it is, and there'll be people who come from up and down the river, local people from all
Mm.
different tribes who will come down for some jungle television, to have this ceremony experience. And they do it as a way to, like, I think as kind of entertainment a lot of times, because it's just a really cool experience. And, but also as a communal thing, you get to see people you haven't seen in a while.
It's
So there's a
beautiful.
lot of hanging out after ceremony in the hammocks, smoking and gossiping and stuff like that. And everybody has the opportunity to sing if they want. it was just such a kind of different experience. And I found like actually like really healing. And there was no focus on healing trauma, talking about your past, anything like that. It was like being with people in this beautiful environment, in this beautiful experience, and the medicine just helping you open to all of that and appreciate it and learn from it.
That's so beautiful. I'm so glad you shared that because that
Hmm.
is the essence of what healing actually looks like, to not
I think
to
so.
not focus on the idea of the work, I think. And even Don Howard, he would always point to his heart and then nod his head, he'd
Hmm.
nod his head no. And that was his whole message, was to try to access and get back into living from the heart. And it wasn't about trauma. It was more about, the awe and the wonder, like you said, and the reverence for life, the gratitude. And it's even funny because over the years I've become more conservative with psychedelics and plant medicines as far as my use, because I'm like, I don't need to go back to the wishing well all the time. It's actually, I like being present, and I just love life as it is. But maybe I'll throw in a hedonic calendar and make myself check in once in a while just to feel that element of nature alone by myself or whatever. But I started to really get into breath work, and I started to go to the Groff breathworks and Dan Brule and all these really powerful, transformative, sort of psychic driving type experiences. It
Hmm.
somewhat, I had some cool experiences and I was like, wow, you can do that with the breath. But I didn't like, again, it went back to, they call it psychic driving. And I started to think, I can't send my mother or guys at work or the average person in society to any of these workshops because they're too intense and they're too focused on that. Um, we're doing the work to get into the nervous system. We're going to shake and scream, and it's very performative.
Yeah.
And what's unfortunate is that it doesn't have to be that, nor should it be that, because I started to share breathwork 4 years ago with little friends, just guys I knew and people I loved.
Little
And
friends or
over
little groups of friends?
little groups of friends, only little people, only people under 5 foot, actually. No. So I
Those
started to
DMT
gather.
elves. I was sharing breathwork with them. It was
Yeah.
amazing.
The elves. So we started doing that. And over time, I realized it was more about the slower, calmer
Hmm.
breaths. And just the only thing that I would ever say now is the awe and the wonder and the gratitude being the piece that we're focused on. And
Yeah.
I see in these breathwork workshops now, everyone's screaming and crying and they're
Hmm.
filming it and marketing it. And I'm like, this is horrible to
Yeah.
like film people crying and market their vulnerability. And they're like, yeah, well, they signed waivers. It's like, yeah, but
Yeah.
they're in a non-ordinary state in the most
Yeah.
vulnerable time in their life, and you're going to film that and share it on social media so you can get more followers, or it's
Yeah.
fucked up. So
Yeah, but it
anyway.
demonstrates effectiveness, right? And that's what kind of like American culture is looking for, is those big experiences. Like it's so telling, like psychic drivers. Like, do we really need to be driving the psyche, the soul? Why don't we just like try to slow down, relax, and open to what the psyche is trying to express to us, trying to lead us toward? It's a much different approach, and the same thing was in yoga too. I mean, the tradition that I really became attached to and did a lot of study within, and it really informs my teaching and my approach to yoga, was all heart centered. And it was really because the Indian root teachers of that lineage started to work with Westerners and saw that Westerners were very, just like the shaman in South America, they saw that the main kind of issue with Westerners is that we think too much and we're too much in our heads. And so the whole focus of this tradition of yoga, this approach to yoga, was to help people open their heart and to live more from the heart. Like one of the root teachers, Desikachar, would say, you got to make the heart the boss and the mind its dutiful servant. Like that's the goal of yoga.
Mm,
And his seminal book is called The Heart of Yoga.
mm,
So I had that kind of orientation from the yoga practice and study already. And when I got into the plant medicine work, for me, it was like, well, that's the thing, is this
mm-hmm,
opening to beauty. Um, because, otherwise we're involved in this personal self-improvement project that is like never ending, instead of the experience initiating us into beauty, into falling in love with the world again, um, and then being led to fight for it because we love it so much. and we don't like to see it destroyed. It pains us to see it being destroyed, and you know, everything made ugly, paved over, and big box stores and strip malls and all of that. So I guess for me, that's like the reorientation that I'd love to see happen is a refocus on beauty and opening to the world, some more receptivity. And so, like the breath work, not about being trying to catalyze some kind of big cathartic experience, but rather to relax, slow down, and become more receptive to the
Yeah.
world. Like that to me is the healing. That's where the reconnection happens, is in that receptivity.
Yeah.
And
I
without
love
that, we're
that.
always driving forward towards some unknown goal. And I talk about like the fantasy of healing as being like a carrot on a very long stick that just seems to always be out of reach. And because of that, it keeps the kind of the capitalist machine running, because there's always something new to try, some new therapy, some new exercise, and there's always somebody selling it and profiting from it.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of like pull yourself out of that and go, wait a minute, like follow the money.
Mm-hmm.
Like if these people really honestly cared about the healing of the world, and they're sincere, and I think I've got something that really helps people, um, they would just be giving it away, wouldn't they? Especially when they're like a Gabor Mate who's already a multimillionaire. It's like, dude, how much more money do you need?
Yeah.
If your stated
Absolutely.
intent is to help heal the world, well, why are you charging so much for all these trainings? And why you keep creating more and more trainings, like these kind of sub levels and super levels? Like I'm like, all you did was recreate that multi-level marketing scheme of the Landmark Forum. So even though you said you didn't like their kind of marketing ploys, you're kind of doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And
And then
manufacturing epiphany, like you said.
yeah, well, and you keep creating more of a market by perpetuating these ideas that, look, everybody suffers from childhood trauma to some degree, and it is the root cause of everything. Like I've seen childhood trauma as like I saw one ad. It said, procrastinate. That's a trauma response. So like everything from procrastination to PTSD has attributed to childhood trauma. It's
Yeah.
insane. And I think the kind of the light at the end of the dark tunnel we've been in for the past 5 to 10 years, however long it's been, is that I think people are starting to wake up to this, and they've gone through enough of the therapies to realize either like what works about those is actually really quite simple, like getting back in touch with your body, learning how to restore your nervous system to a more natural state. That's what actually works, not the going over and over and over the old stories, you know. And so those things are absolutely free. Like those tools that you need to be in touch with your body and to regulate your nervous system require nothing more than your breath and your awareness, and to be in a body of any kind of shape. you know, you don't have to
Yeah.
be fit to be a yogi. Um,
Absolutely. And getting outside more. Some of the most simple things is like get some natural sunlight. You
well,
know,
yeah, that's why, like when you go down to the jungle, a big part of it is going and immersing yourself in a very kind of natural place. I mean, very little, it depends on where you go, of course. But some of those places are really out there, and there's not a lot of amenities. There's not a lot of civilization around. It's a very kind of natural place, and that's a very unique experience for most of us who grew up in the north. And so I think that's a big part of the healing. It's just like, oh my God, just being in nature. Like you could probably go to a retreat center down there and not take anything other than some herbal tea or maybe some fresh cacao juice or something like that, and just chill out in a hammock and feel a lot better after a week or two of that. Away from your
yeah.
phone, away from the screens and the news and everything. Just that idea of retreat in a beautiful natural place goes back to the Greek times, as a remedy to culture and civilization, the cities.
Yeah, I agree. That was actually 90% of what I loved most was 17 or 18 days of unplugged from the
Oh,
smartphone. It was like a digital detox. And then the sharing circles, just that ability to where there's no filming, of course, that's huge. And you're like actually communicating with other people and listening and finding out that, hey, they're a lot like me. We all have a life of pain and suffering and fears and all the stuff that
yeah.
makes us
The
human. And there's
feeling
a
I'm
place
not alone.
you're not
that's
alone, just that
that's so
connecting with
healing.
others. Yeah. And then the
Hmm.
eating together and the being in nature. It's like those are some simple, free things that we just don't have anymore. It's not about what's in the cup. And I
That's
also tell
right.
people, like, you
Yeah.
don't need to go to the jungle because ayahuasca wasn't available to most people until the 90s. And most people didn't know about that until maybe 2000s. I mean, anthropologists were going down there. But if you don't have access to it for all of human history, it doesn't mean that we need it ever.
Hmm.
Not saying you shouldn't go down there if that's something you want to try, but most of the most effective things are free, they're safe, they're effective, and they're right in
They're
front of
locally
us. We just
available. Yeah.
locally available.
Just before I forget, you were talking about like people continually taking psychedelics.
Hmm.
And I guess maybe I've gotten more conservative about that too. In that the way that I view them now is that they should be, or they, I don't know, how strong should I be with my language? I think they they are meant to initiate you into something. So they should be initiatory. And if you have to continually take them, then the initiation failed. So something else um, wasn't present for the initiation to be successful. And so I think like at a certain point, like if you've got the right orientation, see, this is a big problem because if you go into it thinking that it's all about my personal healing and it's, healing my childhood trauma, then you're not being initiated into something, into some new version of yourself, right? Which is what initiation is always about. It's a rite of passage. It's a rebirth, which requires the death of who you were formerly, you know, kind of
Hmm.
psychologically, but also in your role in the community, right?
Hmm.
And so if we think about psychedelics as initiatory, it means like to some extent leaving the past behind or putting it in a bigger context, accepting that your pain and suffering in the past is what actually helped form you and brings with it certain gifts that you're then post initiation meant to be living out and cultivating as your unique contribution to the community. Like that to me is what initiation is about. It's like, what's your niche in the community here? What are your unique gifts and characteristics that could help to fill some gaps in our community?
Yeah.
And so we find that, and you go, okay, well, you've got this certain sensitivity, you've got an openness to the spirit world. You go with Jose, he's going to apprentice you and initiate you into being a medicine person or a shaman, right? Or you've got a great facility for concentration and manual dexterity. Go with Luisa. She's going to apprentice you and initiate you into being a weaver. And you're going to contribute in that way. So it's like putting like our childhood, what we come into this world with, how we're formed by it, in a bigger context that is integrated in community.
Yeah.
Um, like one of the kind of the key moments of neoliberalism that really helped me understand what it is, because it can be a kind of a gauzy term, but it was when Margaret Thatcher said, "There's no such thing as society. There is only the individual." And that to me is the complete antithesis of what you would hear from a tribal person. The tribal person would say, there's no such thing as an individual, there's only community. You're never separate from that. And your role in that community is who you are. So there's no separating yourself out of it, which I think is an illusion. I don't think we can do that really. But we kind of pretend that we're uh, what do you hear a lot? The sovereign individual. I've got a program to help you become more sovereign. Like, so you're a king of your own little tiny empire of one, you know? And
Mm,
that's an illusion because you're not really ever separate from your culture, your community, or the society.
yeah. And that creates more pain and
Right, more
disassociation, as you
isolation.
say, more isolation. That's
Well,
actually
what do they say?
really,
The epidemic of loneliness. It's well, of course. This
yeah,
is what the society is like trying to
missing.
perpetuate
Yeah.
constantly is the
Hmm.
sovereign individual. And it all comes down to you, and it's up to you to like pull up your socks and get your shit together and get out there and be a more effective member of the society.
Yeah, and that you need the healing and you need to focus on getting yourself better. It's not the society that's a mess, it's you. So, and not only should you heal your trauma, you need to heal all of your ancestral trauma as well.
Oh yeah, well
So,
that's the never-ending aspect of it, right? It's like, oh, don't worry. Once you think you've done enough of your personal healing, we've got a whole nother bag of stuff for you to work
yeah,
on.
you've got to heal your whole lineage. And it's
Yeah.
like that is such an interesting weight to
Well, it's
carry.
so hubristic, right? And like
Hmm.
Hillman pointed out that it's all part of the heroic fantasy. And the heroic fantasy is a kind of extension of the myth of the abandoned child. The abandoned child then becomes the kind of cultural hero. Like Moses is a great example of that. And
Mm,
that's really like in the formation of the Western mind is this heroic fantasy that comes out of the myth of the abandoned child. And that to me is exactly what trauma culture is. That's the foundation it's built on. And most people aren't conscious of that because they don't know enough kind of cultural history of the West. But if you dig into these root myths of Judeo-Christian culture, you see this I think at the very core.
mm,
It's people easy enough for them to see the how it's patriarchal, but it's harder for them to see the abandoned child into the hero myth, the singular individual rising above their circumstances, to bring something great to the world.
hmm.
If you talk to people involved in kind of trauma culture, that's like the goal of the whole thing, the hero slash survivor myth. And
Yeah.
that's the greatest thing that you could be. And so then that's what people start to perform on social media is
Hmm.
their healing journey, their survivorhood. Like there's a popular podcast called Conspirituality.
Hmm.
And I've had interactions with one of the guys on that podcast, Matthew Remski, for many years, going back to my time in yoga and being with a kind of a bad guru and reaching out to him. He was writing about these problematic gurus, but he's always writing about the dead ones. He was never confronting the ones who are still alive and out there still causing harm. So I thought he
Sure.
was a bit cowardly, but I went to him and said, look, you've dealt a lot with this and people who have gone through this. What's the approach? I've got a guru of my own who's doing some stuff on the side that isn't great. How should I handle this? And I mean, he didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But one of the things that like really annoys me about him in that show is like he constantly refers to himself as a survivor of a cult. This isn't because he had parents who were involved in some horrible cult and he grew up in it without any choice of his own. No, he's talking about something like cults that he got involved in when he was a full adult grown man.
Hmm.
And that's not being a survivor. Your life was never threatened. You just like got enamored with a guy who had really bad ideas and
Yeah.
maybe questionable morals. That doesn't make you a survivor. So the degradation of terms like survivor and even the word trauma, I think,
Hmm.
does a disservice to the real survivors and the people who have undergone like real trauma, you know, like
Yeah.
things that unquestionably had a profound impact on them, on their psyche or body. That's another part of like the whole trauma movement is like they're not talking about physical trauma. It's all psychic trauma. It's all the unseen trauma.
Yeah.
Um,
And if
But the
everything's trauma, then nothing's trauma. It's like you're putting
exactly.
everything into this one blanket statement, and then it becomes like a virtue signal methodology of I have more trauma than you. Or Brene Brown would say, market your vulnerability and cry on screen, and everyone starts trying to one up each other, and it becomes this sense of virtue. And it's sad because then it strips away from the actual vulnerability that needs to take place and the actual trauma that's already taken place. And it sort of
Well,
discredits all the real stuff that's there.
yeah, and I think like one of the arguments I make in the book, kind of following James Hillman's ideas, is that this focus on childhood trauma centers the archetype of the wounded child. And the wounded child, by its nature, is powerless and vulnerable and completely open. Like children don't have boundaries, right? And so when we see people doing this performative vulnerability and telling their trauma stories on social media to, by the way, untold amounts of strangers,
Sure.
like how much do you actually honor your own experience if you're willing to do that? To
Hmm.
expose yourself and to tell these stories to people you have no relationship to. But I think it's rooted in that, is that, because they're really identified with the wounded child archetype, they are disempowered, which is good for neoliberal capitalism. Have a bunch of disempowered, um, kind of infantile people, um, who have no boundaries, right? No strong sense of boundaries, or of sacredness or privacy. Holding things sacred. That used to be
Yeah.
a term that we'd use.
Hmm.
Now it's all like just it's out there
Yeah.
to what, sell yourself as an authority on trauma or whatever. It's like your bona fides is like talking about your childhood trauma, like that's at the top of the resume,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, it's getting more and more perpetuated. It's interesting, and it's definitely something that I think that's why your article about traumadelic culture resonates so much, and I think more and more people are going to discover it, and it's good. We need to start conversating about all this stuff and bringing awareness to it and having deeper conversations. And I saw, Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. It had nothing to do with the heart or anything to
Mm,
do with like, those kinds of books are interesting because they're being read by the average person now that would have never probably dipped their toes into the field, and that's the first initiatory book they get.
yeah,
And it really leaves an imprint on now their experience going forward and what they're going to seek as far as what this psychedelic thing is.
yeah.
And it's not about the mind at all. I mean, little parts of it for sure are, but
Well,
it's
yeah,
missing a
certainly would
lot.
include the mind, but that's not
Hmm.
all. Like the old idea of psyche, which is at the root of psychedelic, which is supposed to mean revealing the psyche. Well, first we have to ask, well, what do we mean by psyche?
Soul.
Uh, well, the way Humphrey Osmond translated it was mind. So then psychedelics became known as mind manifesting. But we have to understand, like the old idea of mind, like whether it was the Greeks or the Buddhists, when they use this word mind, it's not like how we Westerners think of mind, like post Descartes, that it's all about the brain being, creating thought and it all happening in the brain. So neurobiology and is extension of that kind of split of the mind, heart, and soul. But what the older cultures understood is, what we call mind is more best understood as like a heart mind, like heart hyphen mind. Like, so the mind, the thinking that happens in our head and the feeling in the heart and the intuition and all of that being part of the same complex, not separate. So it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around that mind includes the heart. And what is the heart? Well, it's the sense organ of the soul. It's responsible for our deep knowing about things that are pre-linguistic. So when we talk about ineffable experiences, well, it's the heart that has the sense of the experience. And then with our mind, we often try to translate that experience into words, into language. So, because we feel compelled to communicate things that are going on inside of us. It's part of the human experience. And I think one of the human gifts is to give language to this sensorial, sensate experience that is really ineffable, but the poets and the musicians and the artists get closest. That's why they're
Hmm.
so valuable in our culture. And that's another thing that's being lost, is that kind of art. Art has become so politicized and merely a reflection of the culture, merely a dialogue with the culture, but we've lost the soul images. So I think a big part of like recovering soul is going back, like not going back to your childhood, but going back through the culture
Mm.
to recover some of those images that speak to and feed our soul. And by images, I mean also like music and things like that, not just representational art.
Yeah,
Ritual could be like a kind of image, something that makes an impression on the soul.
I love it. Yeah, you have some amazing ideas, and it's nice talking with you about this stuff. I'm curious
Hmm.
what you're working on now. Are you writing anything new, or are you? I know you seem like you have your podcast, which takes a lot of time, and you're
Yeah.
helping people in the community as well with your coaching.
Yeah. Well, it was nice to package up these ideas into a book because then I could like kind of put it aside
Mm-hmm.
for a little while. I mean, I'm talking about it, and it's good to continue talking about it and
Mm-hmm.
keep thinking about it. But in terms of like writing, I've really enjoying a little break from that right now. I think I'm going to be working with the ideas that are in this book for some time as they kind of get out into the world and
Mm-hmm.
prick up people's ears. But yeah, I release 2 podcasts a month, and so that takes quite a lot of time. And I really value those conversations that I have with the people I seek out because we get to like get into some of these ideas and. I don't really do interviews, I do these engaged conversations. And so a lot comes out of that. And I'd like to point people to that if they're interested in, some of my ideas, what I've been speaking about. If you want to go deeper and find some other people who are kind of part of my soul family, I guess, people who have a similar orientation. You can go to Howl in the Wilderness and listen to some of those talks. But yeah, and then I'm working with people. I work with people one on one. I've been doing, I don't know, it's just been coming, maybe because I'm getting older. I turned 50 last year.
Mm-hmm.
And I found like in my counseling practice, I'm getting more and more men showing up, between like 25 and 40, kind of men going through a midlife reckoning.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really enjoying that work, and I feel like I'm at a place in my life, in my own growth as a man, where I can act as a kind of mentor to younger men. And so I'm really enjoying that, and I think I'm like going to step into that a little more this year. I already do like a 6-week coaching program for men based on archetypal psychology. But I'm thinking of like opening that up more and maybe starting to do like study groups with men who want to work with other men, a kind of education in archetypal psychology and soul work. So I'm just gonna like kind of feeling that out now. It's in like the germination stage. There's an idea. There's some interested guys who I think are really good candidates who, like you, are out in the world doing like real work, not just working in healing culture, but really contributing to their society and their community. So I'm looking for like a few more good men maybe, and we'll see what that turns into. But other than that, I'm playing a lot of music. That's a big part of my life, is playing music and exploring that. That was my first spiritual practice, was playing the guitar. Um, and enjoying my life, and doing some work in the community here. Currently, I've got a few projects that I'm doing here. I'm helping some teenagers make a podcast and learn all the things you need to know to record and edit podcasts. Um, I have like a program where I help kids learn how to play in a rock band together, and that's been really fun. Um, yeah, so that kind of work in the community for me is like just it gives me so much and makes me feel a part of something. And that to me is like, that's the healing,
Yeah.
you
That's
know?
beautiful, man. Yeah, you
And
live a
like,
really
that's the
cool
negative
life.
calling. Like, God, if I was a kid now and seeing what kids have to deal with in this world, what would I want? Well, I'd want to like just be with other people away from screens and like making music and like getting it all out of my system and all of that. Or like with the podcast, like have giving a voice to what teens are going through, even like what they think about like the latest movies or books they're reading. So giving them
Hmm.
a venue to express themselves is so like incredibly rewarding, and feels like I was kind of made for it, because it's like it's what I would want if I was that age, you know.
I love it. Yeah, you're doing a lot of really cool things, and I've already listened to quite a few of your podcasts, and I really love it. I'm excited to listen to more. You've had a lot of really
Cool.
interesting people on, and yeah, you're very smart and open-minded and genuine, and it's really cool to meet you today online, you know?
Yeah,
Um,
likewise, man. I feel like I met a soul brother.
yeah. And I always ask everybody, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world?
If I was going to die today, well, hopefully, what I've already shared. So I'm not going to wait until the day I die to decide what I want to share with the world, you know? So everything I've been doing, there's death looming. Death is
Awesome.
present with me every day. It's why, I've got skulls all over my body. I've got skulls all around this room that you might not be able to see, but that memento mori, that remembrance, that don't take any of this for granted, man, because it could all be gone like that. And David Lynch died, I think, yesterday, and he was someone who I really valued,
Hmm.
because, like, not only because I love his movies, and he had an incredible way of being true to his own dreams and the images that came to him and letting them speak for themselves, but like for what he represented in the culture is someone who valued dreams and imagination and the primacy of those visions and allowing them to speak for themselves through what he was able to create on the screen.
Hmm.
Not many people like him. Like when you watch his movies, the dream images are speaking for themselves. There's no interpretation. There's no trying to like wrap it up in a tidy little message,
Hmm.
which is really being true to the nature of dreams and, I'd say, psychedelic visions. They're coming from the same place. And the moment that we try to interpret them, it's the kind of Western mind, the heroic Western mind, trying to like get a hold of something and pin it down and kind of box it in so that it doesn't have to wrestle with it anymore. Doesn't
Mm.
have to be in kind of ambiguity or uncertainty anymore. You know, all that like, and this goes back to like what's at the root of trauma culture, the willing the impulse to kind of like get down to the root of something, to understand it, to put it in a little box, is a way to deal with the anxiety of not knowing, of uncertainty. And so that's like really one of the kind of the core sicknesses of the Western mind, is that like tendency to want to like box things in so that we don't have to deal with their complexity.
Yeah.
And we see that in the way that the West deals with outsiders and people of different religious backgrounds, that you try to like create one monoculture, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're terrified of the unknown, and that seems to be the underlying, the denial of death almost. And I'm
Mhm.
like you, I like to meditate on my death and think about it as a beautiful inspiration that makes me appreciate the moment and appreciate the day and know that it's very fleeting. And when you do a psychedelic experience, if you do it in a way that's not through the trauma model, that's what is left, is this great giant mystery and the awe and the wonder and the that's the surrender experiment to me, is like the letting go, and seeing what
Well, that's
happens.
like,
You
isn't that like the motto of the Eleusinian Mysteries, was like die before you die? Like this is
That's right.
an experience that every citizen had to have once. So they had to die to the small, individualistic, atomized self in order to be born into the community
Yep.
and to be a contributing member, like a real citizen, a member of the polis. Like
Mm.
Aristotle said, like man is the political animal. And it doesn't mean politics the way we think about politics, but it means being part of the polis, part of the community.
Yeah.
And so that's what the Eleusinian mysteries were, I think, helping to initiate you into. is real citizenry,
Yeah.
which means you got a responsibility to a lot more than just yourself.
Beautiful. Yeah, I've really enjoyed this. Maybe someday we'll do it again. You're a really
Sure.
interesting guy, and I'm excited for people to find you now. I know that I like to share your work already, but I'm excited to share this episode and all your other
I
stuff with
appreciate
people.
that. Yeah,
Yeah,
my podcast is called Howl in the Wilderness because often I feel like a lone wolf howling in the wilderness of modernity, and crying out for soul, and where are my soul brothers and sisters? Who else cares about this as much as I do,
they're out there. Yeah, they're there, brother.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
always nice to kind of hear somebody howling back from wherever they are out
Oh,
there.
yeah.
So I
I love
encourage
that.
people, please reach out and you know if you're not feeling alone right now, or you're feeling less alone right now, well, I struggle with the same thing. So reach out and make contact. Engage
Yeah.
with my work and with me.
Awesome. Right on, brother. I appreciate you very much.
Cheers! I appreciate you too. This has been really nice. Thanks, man.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.